Namaste, welcome to another video in the Skillful Living series. I'm Pamposh Dhar, and today once again I want to talk about the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. But before I do that, I want to just say a little bit about the Gita itself. It's believed by scholars that this text was written about 2,500 years ago in Sanskrit. And the context of the Gita is that it forms part of the much longer story of the Mahabharata. But really it's a standalone piece within the Mahabharata. So you can just study the Gita if you wish for the spiritual wisdom that it brings. And even though it's been a written book from the very beginning, it's been shared through recitations of its verses. The whole Gita is in verse, by the way. And even today in India, people like to listen to the verses recited in Sanskrit. Sanskrit is a language with its own rhythms, and actually listening to these verses in Sanskrit has its own power, if you like. So today I thought I will, with the help of my husband Raju, I will share just one verse from the Gita in Sanskrit.
Na jayate griyate va kadachin nyayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuya ajo nitya shashvatoyam purano na hanyate hanyamane sharire.
Thank you, Raju. That was beautiful. And now just I will read out an English translation of that verse so that we all understand. We were never born, we will never die. We have never undergone change, we can never undergo change. Unborn, eternal, immutable, immemorial, we do not die when the body dies. So the obvious question that arises from this verse is, first of all, who is this we? We, of course, is all of us, but as becomes clear in the last part of this verse, it is not our bodies, because we are more than our bodies. In fact, we are, you could even say, other than our bodies. Because the we that the Gita is talking about is our highest self. In fact, in the next few verses, the Gita refers to this we as the self that dwells in the body. And to put it in a simpler way, I would just say this is a reference to the soul, which is the highest part of us. So the Gita says that the body can be compared to a house or to clothes. So just as we periodically give away our clothes or upcycle them or recycle them, but in some way give up wearing the same clothes because they get worn out, maybe they get torn, or just wear thin from overuse. Similarly, the body also at some point becomes frail, becomes ill, and it stops serving us, stops serving the soul. It is no longer a good home for the soul. So the soul simply lets go of the body at this stage and moves on. So this distinction between the soul and the body is actually quite important to understand, and to understand that the body will eventually give way. The body is real, it's here, I can feel my body, I can touch my body, it's very real, but it's not everlasting. The Gita tells us that the soul is everlasting. The body will have to be given up at some stage. And the soul, the self, the highest self, however you want to think about it, is not affected by external things. So in the context of the Mahabharata. Now, just very quickly to get back to this context, the Gita is more or less of a duologue between Krishna, who symbolizes God in the Gita. He is God, he is an avatar of God, and his friend Arjuna, who's human like the rest of us. And it takes place on a battlefield just before the start of a big, huge war. So a lot of the imagery is war imagery. So Krishna says, as he explains these concepts to Arjuna, he says, the self is not affected by weapons. So you cannot hurt the soul, in other words, and you cannot kill the soul. You can hurt the body, you can kill the body, but you cannot kill the soul. It's also not affected by fire, water, or wind, because it's basically not affected by any of the things of this world, in other words. And a little bit earlier in the Gita, a few verses before the one you just heard, Krishna tells us that that the wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead. And then he explains why this is so. Because the first explanation is what I have just said, that the soul lives on. Death, what we call death, is simply the decaying, the death of the body. But I am not my body. I really am a soul which is simply living in this body for now. So there's nothing to grieve about in the death of the body. It would be like grieving for every article of clothing that wears away, that we have to stop wearing, stop using. And because the Gita is part of the Vedic tradition of India, which has a very strong belief in rebirth, so the idea here is that you give up one body and then the soul gains another body that is better able to serve it, so that if you're coming back to this world, you have a home, you have a vehicle, you have another body. But of course, everybody doesn't believe in rebirth. I understand that. I'm just explaining what the Gita says. But even if you don't believe in rebirth, so long as you understand that death is the death of the body, not of the soul, that's the main point. And even if you can't understand that concept, Krishna says to Arjuna, even if you believe the self to be subject to birth and death, you should not grieve, because death is inevitable for the living and birth is inevitable for the dead. Every creature is unmanifested at first and then attains a manifestation. When its end has come, it once again becomes unmanifested. What is there to grieve in this? These are Krishna's words in the Bhagavad Gita. So if you actually understand that it's the body that dies and not the soul, that's wonderful. But if you can't quite believe that, you still know once you're born, you know that eventually you have to die. Again, it's the body that dies, but even if you believe that you die, then if you already know that, then what is there to grieve about in that? Let's accept facts. But I think it really helps if we understand that earlier distinction I made, that it's the body that dies and not the soul. So this is what I wanted to share with all of you today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week. Namaste.